Yeah, we sometimes deal with light topics here on Radically Rational. Today, however, is not one of those times. We're going to discuss the threat to American democracy and what, if anything, we can do about it. And one of the nation's leading sociologists is going to weigh in. It doesn't get much heavier than that on Radically Rational. Hello and welcome to this new episode of Radically Rational, the podcast. You know how things work. We're bringing facts back into fashion. We're making simple sanity sexy again. We are rejecting crazy coming from all directions. Crazy is not cool. Those are the rules, and if I violate them, I hear about it from an 8-year-old girl.
Makes no sense whatsoever.
Puts me in my place. Okay, got quite a show today because this is our first return guest on Radically Rational, the podcast. I mean, really and truly, brought here by popular demand. I have been looking forward to this conversation so much with one of the country's preeminent sociologists, Dr. Roger Barnes. What a pleasure. And by the way, I'm not blowing smoke here. We had folks say, you got to get that guy back on. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to have done it once, and it's nice to be back again.
Well, you know, sometimes we do deal with some kind of light issues around here, but today's not one of those days.
No.
Thought we'll just jump right into it. We are in danger of losing our American democracy. Not because some outside force is going to take it away from us, but because we are forfeiting it. We are in many cases rejecting it, and we're getting right to the precipice. We're either going to have to fix this or we're going to lose it. So what's the foundational problem here?
Well, you know, I wondered about that myself. And so I went to something called the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is part of the whole Economist magazine. And what I discovered was that they have had a long history of ranking democracies internationally. Well, as it turns out, the U.S. is ranked number 26th now in terms of democracy, and we have been downgraded from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. And they give this rating based on 5 different categories, okay? Electoral process and pluralism, functioning of government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. And we don't do too well on the functioning of government and political culture. The sectarianism, the division that we are experiencing now is a threat to our democracy. There's just no question about that. We rank a little bit, let me check these numbers again. We rank a little bit better than Estonia on democracy, but slightly worse than Chile. You know, we consider ourselves a full democracy, a beacon of light. You know, the United States has this self-promoted history of thinking we are the greatest democracy that the world's ever seen.
And we continue to pat ourselves on the back where it is no longer warranted.
Yeah, and that is simply just not the case. Not too surprisingly.
You know what I find fascinating about this is you being a social scientist, all this is quantifiable.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is based on numerical rankings and really empirical evidence here.
Yeah.
Raj, this is just my impression as somebody who loves our country, and I know you do too, and loves democracy and democratic principles. This is the change I think I've seen over the course of my life. We all know that maintaining a democracy is an ongoing process, and it must be a continual effort, not just between generations, but day to day. But we've lost some ground in the past, in my estimation, due to benign neglect. Mm-hmm. But now I'm seeing more and more an open disdain for democracy.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, I think you have a lot of people in this country who are just not interested in it anymore. We've seen a rise of authoritarianism, the selling of the big lie that Biden stole the election. You know,
and it was a pretty easy sale.
Yeah.
When you think about it, when you think about the fact that it really wasn't that difficult to perpetrate that absolute untruth, that lie, that myth, and that so many people bought it and continue to buy it, that does strike me as a real cultural change.
Yeah. And you have, I think, a political process where you've got half the people engaged in promoting, protecting democracy, and you've got the other half that are just really sort of lazy about it all. Maybe they're interested, maybe they're not, but the fact is that you've got a set of Republicans in Washington, D.C., for that matter in Austin, and people like Josh Hawley, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Madison Cawthorn, the list is long. And these folks are not genuine, authentic leaders, you know. They're demagogues. They deal in deceit. They deal in lies. And they pander to a right-wing fascist element in this country. This isn't the first time we've toyed with fascism. You know.
It isn't, but we were always able to pull it back from the brink because there was this critical mass of reasonable and educated and rational people that sometimes we got way too close to the edge, but they were always able to kind of pull us back between the ditches again. And what I'm seeing now, I think, is a lot of people who are not only okay with getting in the ditch, they can't wait to drive us into the ditch.
Right. And, you know, I think back somewhat famously to 1938 when American Nazis gathered in Madison Square Garden, some 20,000 strong. And that's an amazing number when you think about it, you know. And they had a huge rally in front of a gigantic poster of George Washington. And they were touting the benefits of Hitler's Nazi party in Germany. They were Nazis. Mm-hmm. And what happened to them was called World War II. Right. We can only hope that it's not something like that takes today's fascist movements and relegates them to insignificance.
What is this attraction to authoritarianism? I mean, I've got a half-baked theory here. And actually, my half-baked theory recently, unbeknownst to me until I discovered this, has kind of been backed up with some real research here. Mm-hmm. But people who are attracted to authoritarianism and want an authority figure are people that are just not real confident about themselves and don't like making decisions for themselves and want to abdicate that responsibility and want to say, here, run this for me. So it's kind of infantile. Is there something to that?
Yeah, Theodore Adorno's classic work on the authoritarian personality, he identifies these folks as intolerant, mean-spirited, not given to creativity and curiosity, single-mindedness, and a streak of vengeance that runs through them. People aren't born that way. They acquire those things. Mm-hmm. And you learn that kind of stuff from other right-wing authoritarians. If you immerse yourself in nothing but right-wing media in America today, you know, and if your friends are all right-wingers, and then you know what, you're probably destined to end up in that pile. So it's a matter of socialization. It's a matter of how people are exposed to ideas or not, you know, whether they can mistake propaganda for news. You know, Fox News is not news.
No, it isn't.
And that's pure and simple. But if that's your only source of information, you're getting a very distorted, one-dimensional look at the world. And it's very easy from that to just slide right in to very authoritarian views.
You mentioned the word exposure. Is part of this that it's now easier for people to insulate and isolate themselves? You know, before just going through the world, living life, you would at least get exposed to a lot of different ideas.
Right.
You now have the ability to cocoon yourself and only see and hear that which you want to see and hear.
Here, that's right.
That can't be a good thing.
No, that's not a good thing. And the division that we have in this country politically right now is so sharp that we're congregating into these communities where, the left wants only to be with other people of that view, and the right wants the same thing. And I'm reminded, Paul, when I was much younger, there was such a thing as a Rockefeller Republican. And,
absolutely. In fact, I'll just tell you this right now, and a part of this is just romanticizing my early childhood. But, I'm 68 years old, and my favorite American president during my lifetime is Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah.
I mean, straight up.
Yeah. Well, so where are the Rockefeller Republicans? Where's the Edward Brookses of Massachusetts, the Mark Hatfields of Oregon, or the Chuck Percys of Illinois? The fact is they don't exist any longer. Rockefeller Republicans have disappeared. The last significant one I can think of is General Powell, Colin Powell.
Absolutely.
And
this term,
that was it.
And this acronym term, rhino, there's so much irony there. It's the folks who go around calling other people rhinos, who are in fact the white rhinos.
Yeah, yeah. So
little biology reference.
You think, so we have this situation, don't we, where you're not exchanging ideas, you're exchanging barbs. You're not talking sensibly. You're with one another. You're angry and you're arguing. Tough to come to consensus, if that describes the state of one's political culture.
And we're redefining terms, and that makes it impossible to communicate, because whatever this stuff is that's coming from over there, Raj, it ain't conservatism.
No.
And yet they parade under the banner of conservatism. And I'm a language guy. Good language is precise language that is impossible to misinterpret. Well, there's a guarantee you're going to misinterpret this. Yeah. Because there is no two people in America can agree on what it means to be a conservative, or a liberal for that matter, and yet it completely dominates their every thought, their every utterance, all of their political discourse. Okay, and if you don't even know what you are, but you're self-identifying as something, and then the opposite is anybody who disagrees with you, these terms are completely meaningless. It guarantees that we don't get anywhere.
It strikes me that if you look at the Ted Cruzes, the Josh Hawleys, and people of that stripe, they're not genuine conservatives.
Oh, of course
they're
not.
reactionaries, and they have again, back to the democracy thing, they really don't have an interest in promoting and protecting American democracy.
No, in fact, I think they have a desire to do away with it, which is kind of what I was referencing here. This is more than just benign neglect. This is a lot of people saying, I don't want a democracy. That's not what I want. Mm-hmm. Now, I will use the term because it sounds noble, but it's the last thing in the world I really want. What I want is to win at any cost, regardless of what I have to do for it. And so many of these things that are being uttered by people who label themselves conservatives are the polar opposite of true conservatism.
It's just the political culture, particularly on the right, that exists today is nothing like it used to be when we were much younger. I'm a couple years older than you, but 3 to be precise. And I look back and I think of major milestones in American history, like, for example, the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. Now, if you just put that general question, who supported that act? To most Americans, I would suggest that probably a lot of them would say, well, the Democrats.
Absolutely not.
President Johnson was a Democrat, and he supported it and signed it, and so it would be Democrats. Well, guess what? In the United States Senate, the passage of the Civil Rights Act was carried by 72% of the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
And the Southern Democrats, and we know who we're talking about here, the Stennises and the Eastlands, and that group, they were not supportive of it. I mean, even the noble J. William Fulbright, who so much should have known better, was against it. Consequently, you had a greater percentage of Republican senators than Democratic senators that supported the Civil Rights Act. Can you imagine something like that happening today?
No, but even that gets cynically distorted Because, you hear Republicans now go, we're the party of Lincoln. No, you're not. You shared a name, and then you will have a lot of people who will point out what you just referenced, that the Civil Rights Act, what was going on in 64 and 65, et cetera, it was supported. And by the way, it got over the top because of Republicans.
Yeah.
But don't you guys take credit for that, because that's not who you are right now. Did you see the recent CNN documentary about LBJ?
Oh, yes.
There were a couple of things in there that were so striking, one of which when he was so passionately devoted to getting this legislation through, but he told everybody, we have just lost. We have just completely lost our party forever, and I will never be supported again. But it was something he felt passionate about. And this is kind of a tangential, off-the-wall question, but if he hadn't gotten us bogged down wrongly in Vietnam, how great a presidency might that have been?
Well, I think it would have been a great presidency. I mean, his domestic agenda rivaled that of FDR's.
Absolutely.
In so many respects. It was that damn war. And I protested that war. I marched against it. I did all that anti-war stuff that young radicals did back in the 60s.
Well, and you were right.
Of course I was right. Yeah. And LBJ, he's such an enigma. You gotta give him credit for the Civil Rights Act and so many other good things. But that war, it just 58,000 dead Americans, probably 1 million dead Vietnamese. Mm-hmm. And Lyndon knew better.
And that's the thing. He knew better.
Yeah.
He was saying at the time that he knew better.
Yeah. And he says on the one hand, I can't bring myself to send American boys to do a job that South Vietnamese boys should be doing. And then he does. And I just, in his heart of hearts, you got to think Lyndon knew better. But then, how many politicians today we have
who know better?
That know better? Yeah. I mean, you and I were talking a little while ago about John Cornyn.
He knows better.
Of course he knows better. And yet he allows that kind of trashing of Ketanji Brown Jackson in the Senate confirmation hearings. He has no problem with that. That's a shame. That's a real shame.
Well, and then a lot of our discourse has been reduced to pure whataboutism. Okay, yeah. You make a point, whatever it is, there's always a retort. Well, what about? Well, what about? Well, what about? Well, the most disgusting example of that maybe ever would be Lindsey Graham during these confirmation hearings, because nothing he said was anything other than what about. Nothing he said was relevant to the occasion. None of it was relevant to the process. None of it was relevant for the reason that anybody was there. I really don't know what he was, but people are now afraid to answer questions. All they will do is give you a parallel example in their mind on the other side, whatever the other side is, and that's supposed to justify this.
Yeah. And never mind that Lindsey Graham voted, in support.
To confirm her, yeah.
Yeah, to confirm her in the federal
hearings.
Judiciary.
Yeah.
But not now. The division back, again, the sectarianism is so deep that you can script what the other side is going to do. You know who's going to say what. And you know that it's going to be pretty irrational oftentimes. And so putting that rationality back into public discourse and political consideration.
Is this too harsh? Because my feeling right now is this is all coming down to, as long as you hate who I hate, you're my ally and nothing else matters. As long as you share hatred for fill in the blank, we're allies. Is that too black and white? Is that too harsh?
I don't think it's too black and white, but you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of that famous line in Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical South Pacific, the line that goes, "You've got to learn to hate before it's too late." This is, learning to hate, learning to mistrust, learning to abhor, learning to stigmatize, stereotype the other. That's something that begins early on in life. And
Chicken and egg question.
Breaking those patterns. Oh, boy.
Chicken and egg question.
Yeah.
Have those people always been there, and yet there were some social mores and there was some stigma attached? Okay, have they always been that way and now feel the freedom to run out into the light from the shadows, or are we creating more of them now?
No, I think they've always been there, but they've been repressed. They've been held back because, among other things, they knew my view isn't popular. Maybe they knew that in some sense their views were immoral or were just socially and ethically unacceptable.
Right.
But when did that change? I'll give you the dime. It was 2016. It was the election of Donald John Trump. That's what Trump gave him license. He allowed them to pull off that veil and come out into the open.
He was an enabler.
And tout their extreme right-wing views.
And that's why he is deified by those people, because they see him as the very type of liberator that you are expressing right here. He's given me social and political permission to feel and say the nasty things I have always wanted to feel and say.
Yeah. And so what does this mean for the Republican Party? Well, I think the Republican Party of a Joe Strauss, for example, the Republican Party of a Dwight Eisenhower, that Republican Party doesn't exist any longer. In fact, what we have under the guise of Republican Party might be better thought of as a cult than as a rational, reasonable, organized political entity.
Now, Rod, you know what happens? You use that word, and members of the cult who don't even know they're members of a cult, they'll roll their eyes or they'll actually attack you. You think cult is a little strong? Actually, I don't think it's a little strong. No. Look it up in the dictionary. It is the very definition of a cult.
Mm-hmm. And you got an authoritarian leader at the top of it all. You've got your Donald Trump. The country is in trouble. No question about it. And we've been in trouble before. It's a matter of how we get out of it.
I need to remind myself of that because this seems unprecedented. At least the level of it seems unprecedented to me. But I realize historically that's not necessarily true.
It isn't. But we've got to figure out how to get the hell out of where we are right now. And I think Joe Biden's trying the best he can. But my goodness, look at what the situation, Paul. We've got a war in Ukraine. We've got inflation, high gas prices, things that the president doesn't have a lot of control over.
Correct.
Or much control at all.
Yeah, particularly with respect to gas prices.
Oh, yes. And so, but how do you turn it around? Well, it's not going to be this upcoming midterm election, that's for sure.
No, it's not. And, the term profiles in courage comes to mind. We need to have some people here whose courage can be profiled. Yeah. Because if we're going to pull this back, it's going to be because a critical mass, a core, a nucleus of principled people, and it's going to have to be on the other side of the aisle, they're going to have to make themselves heard, and they're going to have to really stand in the pocket, possibly at the risk of great political loss for them. But we're going to have some principled voices coming from that direction, or I just don't see a solution.
Well, as we sit here today, look back to just yesterday when Susan Collins announced her support for nominee Jackson. And that's touted as a great victory. My goodness.
Think about that.
These Rockefeller Republicans that no longer, exist, who did they vote for? They voted overwhelmingly for Thurgood Marshall.
Absolutely.
They thought the United Nations was a good idea. They thought reasonable social policy, to combat poverty made a lot of sense.
Yeah, when it came to the judiciary here, as long as the president's nominee was qualified, that's all that mattered. And they really didn't view this ideologically, and it wasn't my jersey versus your jersey. And Rod, you're referencing this. I mean, you see votes on even somewhat politically controversial Supreme Court nominees, and in many cases, whoever they were, got 90 votes.
Yeah.
Got 90 votes because people were able to put aside their ideology and their political divides. And it was like elections mean things. The president has the right to nominate this person. My job is not to analyze them ideologically. It's to determine, are they qualified?
Mm-hmm.
And if they're qualified, then I vote to confirm.
Go ahead and confirm them. Yeah. But now the situation, as we well know, is that if a Democratic president appoints a Democratic nominee, then all the Republicans feel duty-bound to vote against him or her.
And to be fair, we've seen some of that. The wind's blowing the other directions too. But yeah.
Yeah. Intolerance. A lack of compassion.
Which is now viewed as weakness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any just decent human act is now viewed as weakness.
Yeah. Well, it's scary. I before I retired last year, at Incarnate Word, I taught a course on the Holocaust. And you got to be careful because you don't want to get into, say, well, that's just like Hitler, or that's just like the Nazis, or that's just like, German politics back in the 30s and 40s.
But these Venn diagrams are starting to intersect a little bit.
But there are some troubling signals. There really are.
Well, with that in mind, you and your wife recently took a fascinating trip. I would love to have you tell that story.
Well, it was a fascinating trip. We lost it. It was a trip to Kansas City to see the Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away exhibit at Union Station.
I love the name.
Yeah, I do too. And it wasn't that far away, and it wasn't that long ago. And what impressed me so much, first of all, was the exhibit took place in Union Station, which is one of the country's grand railroad stations, and in Kansas City. And a beautiful place, beautiful setting for this exhibit. More than 700 items in this exhibit. And on display, lots of reading to do, but interspersed with exhibits and documentary clips and things of that nature. Well, I forget exactly our timing, but Karen and I lost that trip when we had the surge of COVID. And then we said, you know what, let's go ahead and book. So we did, and we joined dear friends who live in Springfield, Missouri, and spent 3 days in Kansas City. Had good barbecue, went to the Negro Baseball Museum, and it was a return trip for me. But Auschwitz was the highlight, the Auschwitz exhibit. Now, I've been to Auschwitz twice. And so I had a friend who'd been there, and he said, you're not going to learn a whole lot that's new. And I didn't. But here's what impressed me so much. They gave you headphones, to walk around. Everybody had their headphones on. If you would, in an area where you were surrounded by dozens of people, if you took your headphones off and just looked around, you would see dozens of people and nobody talking to one another.
Right.
And you had Kansas farmers there, older white guys in overalls. And they were everybody there was in rapt attention to the exhibits. And I thought, this is a success. These people are learning things, and good for them. They need to know this past history. First of all, like you said, Paul, it wasn't that far in the past.
No, it wasn't.
And I thought, okay, I'll give you an example. The German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl made Triumph of the Will, about the 34 Nazi rallies in Nuremberg. And I would show that in class. And students were usually just like that, watching it. They were aghast. So they're showing a clip of Triumph of the Will at this exhibit, and people were studying it very carefully. Now, I'm going to guess that the majority of people there didn't know Leni Riefenstahl, didn't know that this film even existed or what it was necessarily all about. But they knew what they were watching was significant in some historical way, and I suspect they anticipated that it had some contemporary relevance, the full display of Nazi intolerance and stereotypes and prejudice on review.
And the old question is always, that we've always posed, how could the German people let themselves fall for that and become, how did that happen? Okay, so again, we want to be real careful about analogies here, but it's because they really kind of lost touch with who they were.
Exactly.
Is what's going on right now a case of our losing touch with who we are? You recently wrote an op-ed piece for the newspaper that kind of implied that I thought was brilliant, that we can't recapture this until we reclaim it and re-recognize it, and in some cases, familiarize ourselves with it for the very first time.
Yeah. And we might try to authentically atone for some of the mistakes of the past. That might be
examples.
That
maybe
might be one way to do it. Well, I'll give you an example. I just finished a book by a woman whose last name is Kennedy, but her maiden name is Wallace. And she is the daughter of George Corley Wallace. In fact, she was the daughter of 2 Alabama governors. Her mother was governor.
Right.
And her daddy, of course, was famously the governor who stood in the schoolhouse doorway and who proclaimed in his inaugural, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Mm-hmm. And his daughter didn't especially agree with her daddy. But what was significant about it? She didn't agree at all. But what was significant about it is at the end of his life, the victim of an assassination attempt, who's now in a wheelchair, finds himself at 16th Street Baptist Church, the site of that famous bombing that killed the 4 little girls. He wheels his wheelchair down the center aisle and asks for some time with the congregation, and he's given time, and he apologizes. He says, "I was wrong. My policies did bad. And I'm a changed man, and I hope you will forgive me." Whew! I look at some of today's politicians. The names are all over the place. Right. It's not hard to name them. And wonder, your intolerance of LGBTQ rights, your not so covered up racism, your stigmatization of poor people, of Native American people. As you get older, you're going to have a George Wallace moment. You're going to have a reckoning.
Wow.
What in some quarters is called that come to Jesus moment, where you say, "Oh my God, what I did was wrong. So wrong. And I need to ask for forgiveness." I don't know. I can list a lot of candidates, though, who ought to be lined up for that. But I don't know if it's going to happen.
And with respect to the political divide right now, look at what is tolerated in the GOP right now, that they will not repudiate, and yet the only thing that will get you kicked out and ostracized and you can't come to the party or the clubhouse anymore is if you dare to tell the truth.
Well, is right. It's like facts don't matter.
Which is why we founded this show.
That's right.
That was the thing. My wife and I had this thing on a Saturday morning where this is getting crazy. The world is untethered from facts. That can't be a good thing. That really was the impetus behind this whole thing.
So I'm in school, and I'm trying to decide, what do I want to major in as an undergraduate at the University of Kansas? And I'm thinking, well, what are my interests? Well, my interests are political, they're social. I was interested in crime and criminal justice issues. Where's that all happening? Well, it was happening in the sociology department.
Right.
But one of the things that happened to me, being trained as a sociologist, was to appreciate and rely upon facts. Not opinion, not propaganda, not BS, but facts. And I have found that the subjects that attract me, the civil rights movement, the Holocaust, capital punishment, the thing that is best said about those is to simply talk about the facts. Let me just tell you what happened. You know, and how it took place. You can argue about whether it shoulda, coulda, woulda, but let me tell you what did happen. You know, one of the things too, I got to tell you, your reference to my Kansas City trip reminds me of this, is that if you do appreciate this, if you have a value for facts, and you appreciate the study of history, one of the most important things is to go where that history happened.
Because it can change you.
That's right. I've been to 16th Street Baptist Church 3 or 4 times. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I've been to Auschwitz a couple of times. I've got some very vivid memories of these trips and the impact that they have on people. Let me tell you one story. Okay. The trips to Poland, to the extermination camps, there were 6 extermination camps during the Holocaust. They were all located in Poland. Oftentimes students would ask me, well, why not Germany? Why didn't they do it in Poland? Why did they do it in Poland? And the answer, pure and simple, is because that's where the majority of Jews lived. The German Jewish population was less than 1% of the overall population. Poland was a very different matter. Okay. I've traveled there to these extermination camps with the Human Rights Program out of Southern Methodist University, which is headed up by my dear longtime friend, Dr. Rick Halpern. And on my first trip to Treblinka, which was a killing site for a large number of Warsaw Jews, and second only to Auschwitz in the total number of victims. At Auschwitz, 1.1 million died. Treblinka, 925,000. And it was an extermination camp. It wasn't like Auschwitz. It wasn't a work camp / extermination camp. You went to Auschwitz, you were going to die within about 60 to 90 minutes of arrival. One of the interesting things is that the memorial at Auschwitz is over where the old gas chamber was. When the Nazis left, they covered the whole area up with about 4 feet of dirt. So you got to go down to find the originals. This massive killing site, where nearly every step on the ground that you take is you're stepping on over human bones. There's 17,000 stones that occupy this area. Some are little, some are very big. Few have any writing on them. They're just memorial stones. The first trip I made there with Rick and the SMU group, I noticed that, the students would break out into groups of 3 or 4. And then there was this one girl, I'll never forget her. She had a red jacket on. I remember that. I can't remember her name. But I remember she had a red jacket on, and she wandered away from the group. And she stood in the clearing, kind of in the middle of the forest and the stones. And she stood there, Paul, as stationary as the stones that were behind her. And she didn't move. And she just kind of stood there. And I said to Rick, should one of us go up and check her and see if she's okay? And he said, no, leave her alone. I've seen this before.
Yeah.
And after about another, close to 10 minutes, I looked up and she had melted back into the group. Something was going on. And that's the impact that these kinds of things have. It's one thing to read about them. It's another to watch a documentary. It's another to have some sociologist lecture about it, or show a PowerPoint. But the most poignant way to experience this is to go to where these things happen. Go to the Selma Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Go to the concentration camps in Germany and Poland and Latvia and so forth. Go to these places if you can.
I'm having a real light moment going on here. Facts can not only liberate you intellectually, facts can liberate you in a spiritual sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
But first, you have to believe in facts, believe in the concept of facts, believe that you have an obligation to pursue facts, and that you draw conclusions from facts rather than reversing that process, deciding what you want to believe, and then cherry picking things that would seem to support that position.
Yeah.
Facts are facts are not chains. They're liberating.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I learned early on as a sociologist, or in training to be a sociologist, is that facts matter and they tell a story. And they tell the story the way it should be told. Not filtered through some sort of other lens, but through just what happened.
I got to ask you this question. During your long and distinguished and ongoing career as a sociologist, did it ever bother you on a personal level that a certain number of people hear sociology and they think warm and fuzzy and emotion driven?
Yeah.
You could not have a discipline that is more adherent to facts than sociology.
Yeah. And I would spend I spent some of my time trying to distinguish sociology from psychology, from social work, from the other ologies. And yet I always understood this. One of the big influences on me was a sociologist, a Texan, who taught at Columbia University and died very, very young. That was C. Wright Mills, who wrote The Power Elite, The Sociological Imagination, and so forth. But Mills said, if you have that sociological imagination, what you look for is the intersection of social structure, society, and an individual biography in the context of history. Right. Bring together those three things. Bring together society, the individual, in the context of history. And so the kind of sociology I learned said, pay attention to that history. It shapes the future.
I'm about to put you in a horrible position, and I'm almost ashamed of myself before I ask the question, because we're late in the interview, and I'm going to lay this on you. So I'll just take the mea culpa right now. Your long career as an educator, is the fundamental problem here that education has failed us?
Okay. Well, now we're getting somewhere.
I'm ashamed of myself.
Yeah, I think in some respects you can say education has failed us. But I'm not sure how that exactly looks. And I'm not sure, honestly.
Sure.
And I'm not real sure where the starting point for that is. It's like sometimes college professors will say, God, our students are so unprepared. They come out of high schools where, what are they teaching them? Then if you talk to high school teachers, they'll say, oh my God, they're coming out of middle schools where, and this whole thing goes. I mean, who's not teaching? Who's not learning? I think I can identify one thing that's very important. And that is, for too many people, they no longer read. They don't read newspapers. They don't read magazines. They don't read other journals. They don't read good fiction. They read trash if they read at all. But they spend way too much of their time just simply listening instead of actively engaged, which is what reading will do to you. It maybe sounds simple, but I think one recipe for America is to get off their devices, get off their cell phones, turn off the television, go get a good book, and take yourself into it. Not as simple, but how many folks...
It's simply stated, and it would be such a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, that train has left the station?
Probably.
That's sad. I want to read you a quote that I encountered this morning, because evidence to the contrary aside, I do prepare for these things to some degree. And I found this quote, and it really got my attention. And then when I found out who had issued this quote, it really got my attention and got me wondering here if we're just talking past each other. But the quote, first we overlook evil, then we permit evil, then we legalize evil, then we promote evil, then we celebrate evil, then we persecute those who still call it evil. Okay, I read this and I went, Raj, frankly, right on. Yeah. That's exactly where I'm coming from because that's exactly what's going on. And then I saw who the quote was from. The very, very, very far right-wing Texas Freedom Coalition. The point is, that's how they see you and me. And I guarantee you that's how I see them.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah, back again, we're living in these cocoons. We're living in these isolated communities. I mean communities in a broad sense here, where people are not talking to each other, as you meant, they're talking past each other. We deal in harangues rather than conversation. And above everything else, I think we don't listen. We don't listen to what the other side is. Now, I know lots of people, and I can come perilously close to this myself, who will say, Raj, I don't want to listen to him. I can't stand to listen to him.
I at least respect their candor.
They drive me crazy,
Yeah.
What would I learn? How would I benefit? What would be the advantage of listening to these people? That's a good question, But at some point, the conflict emerges because we're not talking to each other.
Raj, I've always felt that I have an obligation to listen. I do not have an obligation to agree. And if I disagree, I maybe have an obligation to express that disagreement. But I've always felt, really since early childhood, and I'm going to give my dad credit for this because this came from him. You have an obligation to listen to the other guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I agree, and I recognize that sometimes that's tough. I remember after the election of Donald Trump, about 3 days later, I had a student who came to class with the Donald Trump for President T-shirt. And I said to him, let me ask you, this was after class.
Yeah.
I said, you voted for Trump. Yeah. I said, why'd you vote for Trump? Well, my parents are in the military, and Trump comes closest to reflecting their point of view, and the friends I know, they are Trump supporters, and so I thought, well, there you have it, He's just learned how to be a Trump supporter, and he's learned to overlook and not pay any attention to notions of kindness, compassion, justice.
Or facts.
Right. Yeah. And so, how do you get that conversation going? Oh, Paul, I don't. That it's real hard. Because at that moment, I didn't want to have a conversation with this student.
Understood.
I just didn't. I was still reeling from the fact that, on the one hand, Secretary Clinton had won the popular vote by millions of votes, and yet this anachronism we call the Electoral College went the other way.
Frustrating when viewed from that point of view, for sure.
Yeah.
I understand what the framers were doing there. I do, and to a large extent, I think it made perfect sense at the time, at that point in history, given the way communication was, et cetera. In other words, they did this for a lot of the right reasons, and I'm not questioning that. I'm just wondering if that is really consistent with the technological world or the political world that we're living in. I understand the argument that if you did away with it, you essentially are just having urban areas determine who is elected president. I get that. So is there a solution here? And
the other way to look at it is that you do away with them, and then everybody's vote counts the same.
I understand that too.
It doesn't matter if you're living on the farm or whether you're living in a downtown apartment.
The argument would be that there are people who have legitimate different interests, economically, socially in some cases, and that you're prioritizing one set of, in many cases, economic values over another one.
Mm-hmm.
Any validity to that at all?
Well, what I find is I look at that and I go, well, let's see. A state like Montana, which does not have a huge population, has 2 U.S. senators. Right. A state like New York, Florida, California, Texas, that have large populations, have 2 United States senators. Right. Okay. Is there some way, I don't know if we'll ever, we have 100 senators, okay? But when it comes to an election, a national election to select a president, it just seems fundamentally to me that if we adhere to the principle of one person, one vote, then that says the Electoral College is a relic of the past. And like lots of relics of the past, segregation, sexism, they still exist today. But we're trying to get past that past. I think we ought to try to get past the Electoral College.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were discussing this earlier. John Cornyn's argument during the Supreme Court confirmation hearing, he suggested that all 50 states should vote on the issue of same-sex marriage. And this is kind of coming full circle. John Cornyn's a smart guy. He knows better than this. We do not vote on issues of fundamental American citizen and human rights. Okay, we don't take a vote on that. And realizing that is why we have a court and why we have judges to protect us from political collective ill will and things that are inconsistent with our foundations right now. But my response would have been to Cornyn, and I was actually screaming this at the TV at the time, we put slavery to a vote. How'd that work out?
Yeah.
He knows better.
Yeah, he knows better. Most politicians in Washington and Austin know better. I can't answer for why they do what they do, what kind of maliciousness lurks behind it all. But it's not healthy, and it's not good for our social system. One of the things I so appreciated about teaching the courses that I did, and 2 of my favorite courses were the history of the Holocaust and the social history of the civil rights movement, was that in those courses I got students in there who were genuinely interested in learning more about that. And they were loving the facts. I mean, they were eating it up and wanted to have more, and I have a favorite story about the civil rights class. I had a young African-American man, really liked him. He was a good student, and he worked hard, very, very friendly fellow. He takes the civil rights class, and at one point, of course, we're talking about events in Mississippi, 1964, when the 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Turner, and Goodman, were killed, and they were buried in a dam on Old Jolly Farm. It was a farm owned by the richest man in Neshoba County, Mississippi, a guy named Olin Burge, Burrage. And we're talking about this whole thing. I've been to Philadelphia 2 or 3 times in Mississippi, and been out to the dam. That's another one of those, if you appreciate it, go there moments. And the next semester, I have this young man in a different class. Has nothing to do with the civil rights movement. I'm getting ready before class starts. People gathering in their seats. He comes in the door, walks past me, and he says, "Olin Burge is dead." And I said, "Justin, what did you say?" And then he sat there beaming. He said, "Olin Burge died. The New York Times just reported it." And I go, Olin Burge. Oh, Mississippi, Philadelphia's Old Jolly Farm, the dam that held the bodies for over 40 days. And he just sat there because he had one on me. That he got the news first. And he was so happy, and is like, I could see that, wait till I tell Dr. Barnes. He won't know that. And I thought, that's what education, when it works at its best, that's how it looks.
That's why you do what you do.
That's why we do what we do.
And there is a reason, Dr. Roger Barnes, why you have been the first repeat guest in the history, the long and illustrious history of Radically Rational, the podcast. And I promise you, you will be the first third guest as well. We've appreciated this so much.
Well, I love what you do. I love these podcasts. I thought the one that you did with Danny Seraphin.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that.
Of Chicago. Oh my goodness! You did one with Dennis Slattery. It was
who you introduced me to, and by the way, what a wonderful man.
Oh yeah. And so I've enjoyed this. I look forward to another return trip sometime in the future. And thank you for what you do. It's a real public service, Paul. It really is, and
it's a compulsion, is what it is.
You are deeply appreciated by those of us who care about facts.
Raj, thank you. It's all about bringing facts back into fashion. So we thank you for listening to and viewing this episode of Radically Rational, the podcast. We do want to refer you to our website, radicallyrational.com. This has been some pretty heavy stuff today, but we do have a sense of humor, and we want that to come through all the time because we want to combine information with entertainment. So on a daily basis, you'll see a news blog, you'll see a sports blog because I'm still a sports freak, and we do daily videos in addition to the fact that we have archived all of these podcasts, and we say this out of humble gratitude. The folks who have come on this show and the things that they have said and the principles that they have conveyed and the way they have made people think, that is deeply appreciated. And we are so far in their debt because they really make up the content of this. So again, thank you so much. Visit the website, radicallyrational.com, and we'll see you next time on Radically Rational, the podcast.